and present their papers. And our discussant is Shapiro, who's currently Assistant Professor of Technology Studies in the Department of Communication at UNC, University of North Carolina. Aaron is a pure product. He is born and raised partially in West Philadelphia before moving to Bel Air or Chelsea. And then he went to Penn for his BA and received his PhD also at Penn, Indiana School. He is the author of 10 peer-reviewed articles, 6 chapters in peer-reviewed volumes, and the book from 2020, Design, Control, Predict, Logistical Governance in the Smart City. In general, his research combines qualitative and interpretive methods to study technology as a conduit for social, economic, and political power. And he's currently working on a second book on the cultural politics of the digital subscription economy. Everyone should live it here, obviously, but does it really matter? Aaron, thank you for making the trip back to Philly, back to Penn, and for doing this. We're really grateful for being here. And so we'll turn things over to Maya or Sophia, whoever's set to go first.
I think my presentation.
Okay. And Sophia, why don't you join the table? Thank you.
Okay, that works. Awesome, thank you. Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. I know it's been a long afternoon, but I hope you have thoroughly enjoyed being a participant in the conference and hearing from my fellow colleagues. I know listening to them throughout the semester was like really enlightening, and I enjoyed listening and learning about all their projects and giving my own feedback. And today I have the pleasure of also presenting my research project titled A Reevaluation of Judicial Ethics in Light of Emerging Social Media Phenomenon. I was advised in this project by Dr. Amy Sepinwall. She's an associate professor in the Legal Studies and Business Ethics Department. And I'm thrilled to share with you all the details of my project. My inspiration for this project started over a lunch conversation with a judge who I was looking to intern with at the time. Our shared ideas and our points of disagreement on the benefits and challenges of the judiciary faces with everyday civilians being so reliant on social media really compelled me to wonder if judges themselves were, 1, technologically literate, and 2, if so, how do they operate on these platforms to distinguish between manipulative tactics such as bots, echo chambers, targeted ads, and fake news. And I was most concerned with these challenges because I myself and those closest to me come into contact daily to some degree with these different manipulation tactics. Throughout this project, I learned a lot about the judicial system, and in Professor Sepinwall's class, she compelled me to grapple with this question: in what ways does exposure to social media content provide new or distinctive challenges for judges to express their opinions on cases and present risks to their impartiality? So, I believe the greater challenge has to deal with conflicts of interest, and technology presents judges with just the latest batch of obstacles to century-old tenets. I believe that we can find some solace in this quote by Lord Hewitt, the Lord Chief Justice of England, in a case that he presided on in 1924, where he says justice should not only be done, but also appear to be done. So what does Lord Hewitt mean by this? Well, to me, I believe he puts the onus on judges, on their demeanor, on their communication, social etiquette and conduct. This is to say, to ignore such a principle is to really harm the credibility of our legal system and to those who oversee it. While I agree that judges have the capacity to self-police themselves, do they rise up to the occasion when it comes to their own conduct and their own interactions over social media? And this is what I intended to unpack throughout this fellowship. So to provide a roadmap to my project, I just want to preface and say that my project isn't necessarily an analysis of the psyche and behavior of judges. That would be more a psychology-based project that would take a lot longer than a year, but rather a deep dive into the ethical existing guidelines governing judges' behaviors, as well as recommend at least a stepping stone of recommendations for judicial ethical guidelines to kind of comport the role that judges have in the 21st century. In other words, my research project was really not trying to determine whether judges are apt at using social media, but rather how they should do so within the parameters of judicial ethics and upholding their integrity. My project is really divided into 5 sections that I'll discuss today. In the first chapter, Behind the Black Robes, What Defines a Judge, I try to dismantle the idea of a judge and unpack what that means, what exactly their role is, and their purpose in society. In the second section, Blurred Lines, How Social Media Has Infiltrated the Judiciary, I provide several case studies of how social media has infiltrated the judiciary and has threatened to varying degrees of gall the impartiality of the judiciary and the respect that the title of a judge has. In my third section, I raise major questions that I've come across with the language of judicial ethical guidelines, both international and domestic. In the fourth section, Learning to Float, I build off of the argument raised by prominent philosophers, namely Dr. Thay Nguyen, Dr. Cass Sunstein, Dr. Bernard Williams, and Dr. Alex Worsnip, to discuss what I think judicial guidelines currently fail to consider, and the importance of being cognizant that judges are not to be tucked away in their chambers necessarily and removed from social media entirely. Rather, I feel that judges should seek to become more technologically literate and engage openly when they can with their constituents to really unveil and educate the public on the intricacies of the judicial system. Following this, on my 5th section, Working Off the Cloak, I propose several recommendations that judges can take into consideration when reevaluating their ethical guidelines. I'll then provide some personal reflection as I've come to kind of realize throughout this project, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you guys might have. So for the first section, Behind the Black Robes, I feel like at face value, it's kind of easy to determine. It may seem easy to determine the exact guidelines that judges have to adhere to with regards to their online behavior, but I think it's really critical to really keep in mind the dual role that judges play in society, one on being impartial adjudicators, and on another being concerned citizens with their own speech rights. So when we really consider the expression, what makes a good judge of character and who is a good judge of character, the criteria that someone might ascribe to that expression may manifest in laudable qualities that we either see in ourselves or in those that we admire, but it's not clear that the criteria used to invoke this expression are essential to the duties and responsibilities of appointed and active judges. Judges, at least those active in the United States jurisdictions, are not primarily tasked with judging the characters of parties involved in court proceedings. Rather, they're more so responsible with making rule-based decisions and based on the facts of the case and perform this duty impartially, competently, and diligently. Who counts as a good judge depends on who is really asked. And when taken literally, at least when I first asked my mom and those closest to me, it can really range from TV personalities such as Judge Judy to those currently serving in the Supreme Court and the nation's highest bench. Dating back to our nation's founding, for better or for worse, the judicial system has worked on the background to shape the society that we live in today. Each of us has an inkling of how a good judge ought to operate in the courtroom and the principles that these individuals should uphold. However, it's not necessarily clear how far these constraints and principles should operate digitally. If judges are expected to remove their biases that would otherwise taint their impartiality, the question really arises, are judges expected to retain this professional guise once they remove their black robes at the end of the day? Or should they be expected to figuratively retain their robes and operate in democracy as removed from partisanship and other forms of partiality that would not be acceptable for them to express within the walls of the courtroom? So consider this quote by the Honorable Benjamin N. Cardozo in his book, The Nature of the Judicial Process, where he says, "I do not doubt the grandeur of the concept which lifts judges into the realm of pure reason, above and beyond the sweep of proving and deflecting forces. Nonetheless, they do not stand aloof on these chill and distant heights, and we shall not help the cause of truth by acting and speaking as if they do." I agree with the Honorable Benjamin Cardozo that there is a level of respect, education, accomplishments that really mold judges' reputation. But I also feel that they shouldn't necessarily take their prominence to excuse themselves to be kind of detached from the public. To reiterate, we do not help the cause of truth by acting and speaking as if they do. And to put it plainly, I feel like we should really start to judge the judges. The vitality of democracy really begs us to do so. Judges, as all human beings, age and mature, where we all have an ebb and flow of emotions, opinions, and other philosophies that only make us more human. Perhaps no other phenomenon really captures this more closely than social media and what we post on it. So it's seemingly the case that looking at judges with this critical lens is not at the forefront of professional ethics. Rather, my research has identified several patterns in the existing literature of legal ethics that seems to be more concerned. First, insights on technology are quite dated and fail to consider the sophistication of social media to cater to each of our vices and virtues. The issue at stake is no longer really having to deal with these fundamental proponents of social media platforms, such as should a lawyer be friends with a judge on Facebook. I think the sophistication of these platforms and their algorithms really begs us to ask if judges are at risk of being stuck in echo chambers and where they're only fed really one side of the story, and if they're even shown a story at all, how is it presented? Second, there seems to be a dense amount of literature surrounding judicial ethics online being published in European countries, and while such an effort to look at the codes of conduct that judges in each country adhere themselves to, each democracy should really start to begin the conversation. Third, the breadth of analysis in the United States detailing ethical codes of conduct is really saturated for attorneys as well, but it's not nearly as much for judges. Again, thinking back to the Cardozo quote, while judges are laudable figures in our society, this is not to say that they're above self-reflection. In fact, judges ought to be more proactive, at least in my opinion, in their efforts to educate the public on this more elusive branch of government, because the public cannot be expected to respect decisions from a process that's shrouded in mystery and made by someone who is withdrawn from society. I believe social media presents judges with the opportunity to do so, and that the fact that we entrust judges to have this resolute sense of integrity only makes it more important that they have a public online presence and they're able to allow the public to really gauge whether or not a judge is maintaining such integrity. I personally believe that we can't expect the public to make decisions, to respect the decisions made by people who are entangled in modern society through means such as social networking, yet refuse to admit how such channels may influence their actions, both in and outside of their professional work. My second section discusses blurred lines and presents different case studies on how social media has really infiltrated the judiciary. While these cases are not exhaustive, they don't necessarily embody the majority of judges presiding on circuits. Many judges really do hold themselves to the highest degree of accountability in the courtroom. I'm just making the argument, at least throughout my project and my research, that such accountability should extend further into the cyberspace and also be subject to re-examination. So social media is really rife with conversations that are seemingly never-ending, a never-ending thread of opinions, who one chooses to follow, what someone posts about, and which platform best captivates our personalities. Each platform is really tailored to empower users and create and share ideas and increase interconnectivity across the globe. Take, for example, Meta's mission statement to give people the power to build community and bring the world closer together. At least 81% of adults and 73% of adults aged 50 through 64 report being on at least one social media site, which surveys also suggest that Facebook is the top contending platform for these age groups. And from these numbers, it stands to reason that in one regard judges are on these platforms, and that as society is moving to communicate with one another on these platforms, the judiciary is as well. So just to present you guys with the first case study, this embrace of interconnectivity really turns egregious when we examine cases such as Judge Nikita Blockton, who was cited back in 2019, 2020, 2021, and until her removal in December of 2021 to have violated canons 1, 2, and 3 of the Alabama Canons for Judicial Ethics and participating in activities that fail to preserve the integrity of the judiciary. prejudicial to the administration of justice and bring her judicial office into disrepair. While each of these canons outline the responsibility of the judicial office at large, I believe that there is something to be said about specifying how violations are equally threatening to the reputation of the judiciary, if not more. When Judge Blockton is entered on Google, many articles detail her violations, which include making numerous threats, slurs, and improper comments to staff, lawyers, and litigants concerning the cases that she presided over, as well as concerning fellow judges with whom she worked with in the past. In addition, Judge Blockton made various Facebook aliases to inappropriately communicate with litigants. While these infractions, coupled with several other complaints, led to an investigation and eventual removal from her bench in December of 2021, such cases ought to highlight the vulnerabilities that even judges share when using social media. I'll explain later how state-by-state ethical codes fail to sufficiently address the various forms of digital activities judges may engage in online. And I believe that had these been more specifically mentioned in Alabama's codes of conduct, Judge Blockton would have been removed a long time ago. There are other cases that I examined in my project regarding the failures of judicial guidelines to really adequately punish the judges that have pretty much engaged in pretty egregious conduct online. For example, Judge Robert Schmidt was found to have posted various memes that are conspiratorial in scope and had made repeated comments on Facebook that indicated that he was engaging in political activity beyond his own run for judicial bench in the state of New Jersey. In his case study, I examined the arguments raised by Harvard professor Cass Sunstein to really explain how conspiracy theories feed off crippled epistemologies and that their viral spread to create information cascades that manipulate and leverage our emotions and reputations only further these theories to spread from individuals who have low thresholds of acceptance to those with higher thresholds. Those with higher thresholds are judges, among judges that we would like to believe they have. Furthermore, in the case of Judge Jim Lamney, I believe the intricate use of language within ethical guidelines really limited how judges can be punished regarding their online behavior. Judge Lamney posted to Facebook reprehensible content, such as essays written by Holocaust deniers, had called Muslim immigrants foreign mud, among other racist, conspiratorial, anti-Semitic, and xenophobic content. Such content, while overtly anti-Semitic and anti-immigration and xenophobic, Judge Lamney was only cited for having violated his judicial responsibilities by posting in a partisan nature. While partisanship is to be of concern in the judiciary, the fact that the Tennessee ethical guidelines failed to consider the risks that Judge Lamney himself had by posting and viewing such content and the impact that can have on the public perception of the courts is pretty concerning. Judge Lamney was only publicly reprimanded and instructed to complete an educational ethics program, but I believe that such measures fall on deaf ears unless clearly written into the code of conduct that judges adhere to. In addition, there was also former Judge Joseph Quintino, a former Superior Court Commissioner who had shared various far-right conspiracy theories from various Reddit threads onto his Facebook. And once he was ordered, following his removal, to post less about these content and kind of get rid of the traces that he had digitally, he quoted that he said that he was unfamiliar with the technology, and so it still remains today. But judges are themselves increasingly aware that they ought to address this gap in their guidelines, as stated by the Honorable Erica Yu from the California Supreme Court Committee on Judicial Ethical Opinions. She writes that justices are using social media more than ever before. While social media can be a powerful tool for connecting our friends and communities, judges have a unique responsibility to ensure that their statements instill public confidence in the impartiality and the integrity of the judiciary. So while cases like Judge Lamney's are chilling, I believe they really highlight the need to integrate perspectives such as yours to critically evaluate where state guidelines are not clear. As the cases I presented demonstrate, there are many challenges with the ethical guideline language that judges refer to today. For one, vague terms for one, vague terms intended to allow judges to self-police their online activity contradicts the pointed nature of the language that these same judges wield in issuing sentencing and opinions. Second, such guidelines do not account for the ever-evolving threats to individual epistemology and the national security manufactured by malicious actors via social media. Moreover, the non-binding nature of international recognition of ethical guidelines poses further obstacles in remedying an understanding of what it truly means to be an effective, impartial, and fair judge, especially because a lot of these international guidelines are non-binding. There's really no means, at least internationally, to really weigh in on this issue. And I also included a quote by Professor McPeak, where she states that each U.S. state's Judicial Ethical Board has written codes of conduct for judges to follow, but most don't expressly address social media norms of today, nor account for the shifting technology. And given the increased polarization in the country, we are nudged to kind of communicate quickly without really thinking, and that poses dangerous risks for judges. So my fourth section aims to nudge judges, or even the ordinary citizen, on how to float above the sea of misinformation, disinformation, bots, and other manipulation tactics. In doing so, I utilized the perspectives of 4 prominent philosophers, including Dr. Thein Eugen, Dr. Cass Sunstein, Dr. Bernard Williams, and Dr. Alex Worship, to really frame my argumentation. Pretty much in my argumentation, I use each of these philosophers to describe how epistemic bubbles and echo chambers can be addressed if we take into consideration, one, the role of judges, how they evolve, as well as how the ordinary citizen really ought to integrate their own sense of integrity into their professional lives. Dr. Alex Worship in particular, I really focus on how really diversifying our news sources and understanding the dangers in restricting our sources that we make available to us should be addressed, especially in the judiciary, as the guidelines don't currently offer. And in my 5th section, working off the cloak, I just propose 4 kind of stepping stone recommendations across state guidelines that don't necessarily seem to go from state to state. The first being maintaining a professional tone and self-awareness. The second being a regular review of one's social media presence and adjusting privacy settings. The third, taking measures to educate intimates, being mainly spouses, on the sensitive nature of a judge's work. And 4, taking measures to educate themselves about developments in social media, as well as diversifying their online sources of information. So this is just another quote from my paper, where I say that the virtue of judges using social media lies in providing the public with an opportunity to connect the judiciary in newfound ways. I believe that even though that the case studies I presented before are pretty egregious, there is a way to kind of further humanize the judiciary, and it starts with being able to communicate with them directly. And I provided 2 examples of 2 prominent judges who are very regular, avid users of Twitter that I follow. As well as, I'm going to leave you guys with this quote by Presiding Judge Stephen Dillard and Chief Justice Bridget McCormick. Judges are public servants, and we have a duty to educate the public about the judiciary's unique role in our democracy, its decision-making processes, and what the public has a right to expect in our courthouses. But to do this effectively, judges need to rethink how we and our courts engage with the public. In terms of my concluding remarks, I really found that this project was really enlightening for my own understanding of how I use social media, especially given I'd come from a first-generation background, so understanding how platforms, especially such as WhatsApp, have been completely eye-opening in terms of how information is spread on these platforms. But I also provide 3 other areas of research that I think a longer-standing research project can also integrate, given this topic. And I would just like to thank the Mitchell Center, Professor Seppenwall, doctoral candidate Michaela Lobo, my friend's family, and the PP department for kind of helping me with these research endeavors, which have been really enlightening. Thank you.
Okay. Hello everyone, thank you so much for joining us today, and my name is Sophia. Today I'm presenting on my study titled Gendered Science Communication, the Role of Speaker Gender and Pitch in Perceived Credibility and Persuasion of Climate Science. So first I'd like to thank Dr. Kim Wolf, who's also here today, and Dr. Jung Kim for advising me, and of course Andrea Mitchell Center for sponsoring this project and giving me this opportunity. So as everyone's probably aware of, climate change is the major challenge that we as a society is facing today, and it has potentially catastrophic consequences. But unfortunately, it is also a highly politicized topic, and the public is deeply divided on its causes and solutions. As with any other scientific subject matters, the challenge lies in communicating and educating the public on the science behind it. Science communication is a difficult task since the same information is interpreted differently by different individuals and interest groups. Therefore, science communication necessarily involves not just education, but also persuasion, and strong persuasive messages have the power to influence policy support. Speaking of the study of persuasion, there are two areas that scholars tend to focus on following the elaboration likelihood model. So first is the central route, and that involves the content of the message. For example, when we study the central route in science communication, we can investigate what type of evidence we can use to best convey the mechanisms behind climate change, for example. Alternatively, there's also the peripheral route, and to my knowledge, this is a less researched area within science communication. The peripheral route deals with the context under which a message is conveyed. So that involves attributes of both the speaker and the receiver of the message, as well as the environment. Examples of those include the gender of the speaker or attributes of their voices, which are areas that I'm focusing on in my study. As previously mentioned, the variables of interest in this study are gender and attributes of the speaker's voice, specifically voice pitch. First, looking at gender, prior research has indicated that female speakers tend to be perceived as less credible than male speakers in political and commercial advertisements. And even though there's limited research in the field of science, I think we can expect that the same pattern will be seen because science is a historically male-dominant field in which women are underrepresented and often considered to be less capable and perhaps less credible. So these biases against female scientists may extend to females who communicate science. On the other hand, voice pitch also plays a role in how people perceive a message. And many studies found that speakers with lower voice pitches are associated with more positive impressions and have greater voter preferences. Given this background, I framed the broad research question of this study to be, how does speaker gender and voice pitch affect, 1, their perceived credibility, and 2, receivers' climate beliefs? And here are my hypotheses and questions. So hypotheses 1 and 2 states that speakers who are male and who have a lower pitched voice will be perceived as more credible when they convey information pertaining to climate change. However, perceived credibility is different from change in opinion. So in other words, people who could perceive a person as credible, but they may or may not change their belief according to what the person says. So this study attempts to measure both perceived credibility and change in opinion, which I'll explain more in the methodology section that follows. The research questions 1 and 2 here asks whether male speaker and lower pitched speakers will also lead to greater change in climate belief. These are research questions because I wasn't able to formulate hypotheses based on existing literature due to how scarce they are. And finally, I look at interactions between attributes of the speaker and attributes of the receivers, particularly gender and political affiliation. And just to briefly go over my methodology, I did a survey experiment online, and this is roughly what it looks like. So I started with demographics questions, and then participants were asked about their opinions in climate change. Then they were randomly assigned to either one of the 4 treatment conditions or one of the 2 control conditions. So the treatment conditions all had very similar stimuli, and this is an audio recording explaining why climate change is caused by human activities, such as fossil fuel burning. But the speakers were of different genders, and their voice pitches were also manipulated. So the 4 conditions are high-pitched male, high-pitched female, low-pitched male, and low-pitched female. And then the 2 control conditions were also recorded by the same speakers, but they had a message that's completely irrelevant to climate change. And then after the treatment or the control, participants answered the same climate change questions again, and this was taken as the measure for climate belief. Lastly, participants answered questions about how they perceive the speakers. These questions were taken from the Perceived Credibility Scale developed by Hendricks et al., and the questions loaded onto 3 factors, which are expertise, integrity, and benevolence. So taken together, these are supposed to indicate the perceived credibility of the speaker. And these questions went last in the survey so that they don't potentially interfere with people's climate belief and other answers to other questions. Also, just to briefly describe the final sample, it consisted of 645 American adults aged 18 to 92, and they're split pretty evenly between Democrats and Republicans and between females and males. So the table shows the details. Now I'll share the results. So first, looking at participants' climate beliefs, all 4 treatment conditions were effective in increasing participants' belief in human-caused climate change. As you can see in this graph, so the yellow bar here indicates the average climate belief of those in the control group, ranging from 0 to 1. And then the blue bar here shows the average climate belief of those in the 4 treatment groups collapse. So the coefficients here in the regression model shows that, on average, belief in human-caused climate change was higher in the treatment conditions than in control by 9.8 percentage points. However, no one treatment condition was meaningfully different from the other treatment conditions, so all were equally effective. And when I collapsed the groups by gender or pitch so that I can look at male versus female, low pitch versus higher pitch, there was also no significant finding. So, as you can see from these tables here. Then I moved on to examine the perceived credibility scale. And in the table here, the second to last row, the means, shows the mean score for all the treatment conditions. So you can see how rated expertise on average was 0.84 out of 1, and perceived integrity and benevolence were lower at 0.77, which is also expected because this is very scientific and educational content, so expertise should be higher than the other 2 metrics. However, as you may be able to tell from the numbers in this table, the group means for the treatment conditions were also not significantly different from one another, and this was confirmed by a NOVA test. So in conclusion, similar to climate belief, participants rated the speaker's credibility highly similarly, no matter if they're high pitch or low pitch or male or female. So hypotheses 1 and 2 don't seem to be supported. Lastly, looking for interactions between treatment conditions and partisanship and gender of the receiver. So I found that low-pitched male worked particularly well for Republicans. As you can see here, it's a condition that narrowed the partisan gap by the most. Additionally, looking at receiver gender, high-pitched male condition, as shown here, worked particularly well for female receivers. However, these are also by pretty small margins. And just to summarize, so none of my hypotheses about pitch or gender were supported, and for interactions, it remains unclear. Even though I found something, it's probably not captured by a linear relation and doesn't seem to be systematic. Then just want to talk about why there's this discrepancy between my findings and findings of past studies, which tend to find that people have a preference for male voice and lower pitched voices. So first, I just like to acknowledge that most of the studies in my lit review were not from the field of science communication. They were mostly from, say, marketing and other like voter preference or political content, but not science communication. So I think one can argue that the role of the peripheral route in science communication may not be as pronounced, because when people listen to scientific content, they will be more likely to focus on the content itself rather than the speaker. So that's one possibility. Secondly, the length of the stimuli used in my study compared to past studies are also different. So mine was a 2-minute long voice recording, whereas in past studies, it's very common to use something that's like a word or a sentence, something like hello. So I think the length could have contributed to the difference. But it was hard for me to condense it further because of how you still need the message to be persuasive enough with a lot of concrete details. And lastly, and very importantly, this study employed a between subject design rather than within subject design, which was popular for prior studies. So my argument is that between subject design would be more realistic to what people experience in our day-to-day lives. You're not very likely to hear the same message repeated by different speakers of different voices in the same setting. So that's my rationale for using a between subject design. But future studies can look into compare within subject and between subject using the same message. And then, of course, there are other limitations that the study has. For example, the sampling method was not representative because it was a convenient sample from Prolific. And the sample size of 645 was also not the greatest. And due to limited resources, this study interpreted gender as a binary concept, which is of course not realistic and representative of our population. Despite these limitations, I believe that this study has gone through some pretty thorough testing, and it seems that if any gender or pitch biases exist in science communication, it would be pretty small. So maybe we can end on a more optimistic note here. And thank you so much.
So I prepared some comments just to reflect. Okay, just to reflect on what I saw as central themes running across these. So what do we mean when we say that something or somebody is objective? What is this thing that we call objectivity? Is it an ethic, a qualification, an accomplishment? So I ask this because it seems to me that the thread running through these two projects is that both of you guys are presenting a cautiously optimistic, if conditional, defense of objectivity. For both Sophia and Maya, objectivity is an ideal, something we must strive for and continue to strive for, however imperfectly, if we're going to participate in this democratic republic as responsible citizens in this kind of crazy moment that we're living through. Whether we're talking about climate change, as in Sophia's project, or the legitimacy of the legal system in Maya's, objectivity looms large as that which must be defended, even as we acknowledge its limitations and grapple with the boundedness of our rationality. Of course, the great irony is that it's precisely our subjectivity, our beliefs, our prejudices, and our relationships that make us human, but which also make us the most vulnerable to bias or partiality, precisely when we need to be the most objective. What objectivity means is itself, of course, dependent on the context you're talking about. So I want to specify what I think these guys have in mind when I'm referring to your projects as having something to do with objectivity. And I think that is something that might be called subjective detachment. This sense of objectivity has to do with individuals, so that when we say that someone is being objective, we're talking about their ability to stick to procedure or protocol in making some evaluation, judgment, or decision. And it's because of a person's ability to acknowledge their own dispositions or biases or preferences, and then take steps to ensure that those dispositions don't influence judgment, evaluation, or decision. So there's a kind of a moral valence to this sense of objectivity. especially when officials are involved. Police actions, for example, when police actions are driven by prejudice against racial minorities, or when police policy decisions are based on political beliefs rather than evidence, we recognize that I'm just going to take this off, excuse me. We recognize that the police officer or policymaker was acting without objectivity, and we infer from that that the lack of subjective detachment, our inability to detach ourselves from these decisions, can have harmful or adverse outcomes. This is the sense of objectivity that I think both of these projects are concerned about in their own way. And in both projects, the stakes could not be higher. Maya's project begins with what she calls the moral quandary of the judiciary. Should judges' behavior be held to the same standards when they're inside versus outside the courtroom? This is not a new problem, and it's not only a problem to the judiciary, but it is especially a problem for the judiciary because according to both custom and code, judges must abide complex prohibitions against certain kinds of self-expression, especially as it might pertain to what is considered political in a given moment. Judges, more so than other civil servants and others in office, are the embodiment of the court. And if this is the case, then where does the person end and the office begin? So now, if this is not enough, that overarching problem of the judiciary, Maya throws social media into the mix to complicate things. She writes, quote, "The ability to be a good judge in the digital age is complicated by the complexity of separating what is posted and shared online from verifiable facts." Indeed. There are many good reasons for judges to participate in the digital sphere on, say, a platform like Twitter. According to Judge Douglas Nazarian of the Maryland Court of Special Appeals, whom Maya quotes at length, judges use social media to participate in professional communities, debate best practices, discuss professional development, mentoring, work-life balance, and similar issues that confront appellate courts and practitioners. But participating in these communities raises novel challenges, and the policy just has not been able to keep up with the technology. Tiny distinctions between acceptable and unacceptable behaviors for judges are becoming less clear, right, to say the least. Should judges, for example, have to disclose their appointment or post disclaimers to their online profiles? Does retweeting mean endorsement? And of course, in a landscape of clickbait headlines, targeted advertising, and algorithm-driven feeds, many worry that judges will be unduly influenced by social media, threatening their capacity to remain impartial in the courtroom. And then, even complicating matters further, is that there's no uniform policy response. It differs across jurisdictions from the municipal and county level to the state and federal level. Each of these, and then across the US, these places have adopted different approaches to governing judges' relationship to social media, their online activity. So Maya expertly draws on the literature to specify three broad approaches to how we might govern judges' use of social media. The restrictive approach holds that judges should have a highly limited presence on social media, assuming that online activity can and will lead to conflicts of interest. The cautiously integrative or permissive approach advocates for developing a social media specific kind of ethics guidelines. And then the digitally enlightened stance maintains that conflicts of interest arising from social media are in fact not fundamentally different from any other kinds of conflicts of interest, and they should be treated as such, similarly to traditional media or anything arising from interpersonal relationships, which you go into greater detail on. Walking us through these different views, Maya addresses the strengths and weaknesses of each and arrives at a set of policy recommendations. These recommendations are pragmatic in that Maya insists that we can't deny the fact of social media's influence on society and culture, but they are also idealist, I think, in that Maya remains committed to impartiality, at least as an ideal that's worthy of defense and toward which judges especially must strive, if never fully achieving. So I read these recommendations as a kind of pragmatic objectivity. While it's unrealistic for us to demand that judges live a monastic lifestyle, hold up from society, we kind of continue to act as if they are doing that, and that's just not plausible. Maya writes, quote, "We can't expect the public to respect decisions made by people who are entangled in society through social networking channels, and yet refuse to admit how such channels may influence their actions both in and outside their professional work." So this, in my reading, is the crux of the problem. We need to strike a balance that recognizes the impossibility of true objectivity, but nonetheless works to achieve some semblance of subjective detachment. Sophia's study is less prescriptive, but no less adamant about the urgency of finding the right balance. Her paper begins with a powerful observation. This is a quote, "The study of science communication necessarily involves the study of persuasion." And that's like a perfectly succinct sentence characterizing this project. And this deduction that Sophia is making is presented at the end of the very first paragraph. And it speaks to the crisis of objectivity that we're confronting today. No matter how scientific it might be, evidence must always have an advocate. And despite the idiom that facts can speak for themselves, they absolutely cannot. The scientific consensus on the causes of climate change, Sophia's example, has not registered for the 77% of Republicans who don't believe that human activity is responsible for rising sea levels, glacial collapse, polar temperature spikes, the list goes on. With the 30% of all American adults who, as a recent survey found, don't believe that they need to be concerned about global warming's effects. These are the people who must be persuaded that the evidence is indeed objective. As Sophia suggests, quote, "Communicating science is a complex task since the same information is often perceived and interpreted differently by different individuals, communities, and partisans." Or in the terms I've been trying to use here, I don't know how well, but we need more subjective detachment when it comes to the climate change, at least if we're going to do anything to stop it. So drawing on the literature from political psychology and persuasion studies, Sophia is interested to understand how the attributes of science communicators, on the one hand, and the consumers of scientific information, senders and receivers, play a role in this process of persuasion. If evidence needs an advocate, then to what extent are our dispositions towards people clouding and coloring our interpretation of information? Sophia hypothesizes that gender may play an important role here, at least as a peripheral dynamic in the persuasion process, since women are subject to severe barriers to entry and biased evaluation in STEM fields. And because women are historically underrepresented in the STEM fields, the stereotype is that science is a male field. So it stands to reason that, as you point out in your presentation, you would expect women to be trusted less. On top of this, there's also this interest in intra-gender dynamics. Does the pitch of a presenter's voice, male or female, affect how information is received? Now, at first I was like, okay, gender and voice pitch, I get it, but like, what? And then I was doing some reading, and I learned that Margaret Thatcher famously worked with voice coaches to lower her voice by apparently 60 hertz between the 1960s and the 1980s, because there's this common understanding that a lower pitched voice would be taken more seriously. So this is a serious concern. With a sample size of around 650 participants, which is no laughing matter, Sophia conducted an experiment to test whether media consumers' political affiliation and/or gender would interact in a meaningful way with their presenter's gender and voice pitch, and whether that would influence how scientific evidence of human-caused global warming was received. And the remarkable finding, as you just heard, is that gender and pitch do not seem to play a role here. So Sophia concludes that if anyone is interested in science communication as a form of persuasion, they should worry less about the presenter than the information presented. In this study, at least, subjects did demonstrate a modicum of subjective detachment when it came to their dispositions toward gender and pitch. So I just want to end by thinking with you guys. I have some ideas about how you might pursue future research. Sophia, if you take this further, I would challenge you to expand from questions of gender and voice pitch to other fulcrums of identity and cultural politics, especially. So I'm kind of interested to know, like, if you brought in the visual cues, how things might or might not change, and like even then, you know, like bringing in, you know, sort of standardized metrics of like how attractive people are perceived to be and whether that influences. And then on the other hand, whether information is presented as broadcast or published by a highly branded and trusted source, Fox News, CNN, right? Like, to what extent is this like corporate branding of political identity also playing a role here? Maya, if you pursue this, I would be interested to see you bring more critical attention to new media formats in relation to older and more traditional, conventional media formats, to tease out more thoroughly what's different about social media than writing an op-ed. Yeah, so like teasing out new media versus old media. Also thinking critically about the extent to which the echo chamber and epistemic bubble, whether that has the kind of empirical backing that we might expect it to have, whether people are not as susceptible to the hypodermic needle of ideology as we might assume, and then finally whether there are differences between judges who are elected and those who are appointed. So I've just been talking about this sense of objectivity as subjective detachment. There is another sense of objectivity which refers to empirical rigor. Was the sample large enough or representative of the population? Indicators, were they good enough proxies for the underlying mechanisms and so on? These are the issues that scholars grapple with all the time. And while I can't, unfortunately, speak to these papers as an expert in legal studies or persuasion studies, I can say that I am extremely impressed with both of you, how you handled the research process. So I will conclude by saying congratulations to you both on your excellent papers.
For taking the time to really read my paper and come up with these very interesting points that I can kind of take my research in the future with. I'm currently thinking of pursuing a PhD, so just taking that in mind is just really fascinating, and I really appreciate it, especially in terms of thinking about new media versus old media. In terms of just trying to narrow the scope of the project, there were so many kind of moments where I had to kill my darlings and not being able to pursue certain avenues, but it's really reassuring to know that those avenues are viable. So thank you.
Yeah, similarly, thank you so much for taking the time to read my paper and for giving this wonderful review of my literature. I think it's awesome. And also the point about comparing different media, I think it's definitely important, and me and my advisor actually are trying to pursue that, because we've done a very similar study to this one before, but instead of having voice recordings, we were looking at just having people read articles. And comparing the margins, my study is actually 2 times larger than having people read. So we think it's definitely interesting comparing just reading versus audio versus visual and audio. So yeah, thank you so much for pointing that out too.
Just a question for each of you. Mike, start with Sophia. What would the basis be if it were the case that lower pitched voices are more persuasive to people? To the extent that that has been found, what is the explanation typically given for it, an evolutionary basis or some other? Be curious. And I'll just start there.
Yeah, I've seen some paper explaining it as evolutionary, especially for the preference for lower pitched male voice. It's like a reproductive advantage, because male who have lower voices tend to be like larger in size or something. So it could be more sexually attractive, so that's one explanation given.
And I was also, this is my other question, if you wouldn't mind just briefly sharing some of your other research, which has been more, that has found some findings about what makes things more persuasive, like when you make appeals that are less expert-based but more content-based. I'm not saying it well, but I just think it might be interesting to the audience if you just share what has been shown to be effective with regards to climate change education.
Right, so in my prior study, I compared two different types of evidence. So the first one would be just presenting the scientific consensus, like stating that 97% of scientists agree that climate change is human caused. The second one would be using causal evidence, so directly telling people how the whole carbon process or fossil fuel burning process is related to rising temperature. And we found that, of course, causal is more effective by a pretty large margin.
Great work, both of you. I have a question for each of you, and I'll start Maya. I thought that Dr. Shapiro's point about elected versus appointed judges was really interesting, and partly because of the word constituency, which I heard you use at some point. And I wanted to push you in thinking about what, especially with elected judges, we think about politicians who very actively use social media as a campaigning process, and thinking about how or whether judges should use social media as a platform for re-election or something like that. And then relatedly, but perhaps differently, in your recommendations, are you suggesting, I think you used the word conduct a couple times, or professional education, that there's a mechanism for professional education, and I'm curious whether you are differentiating between this very Facebook, like boomer use of Facebook that is perhaps for liking the children's, grandchildren photos and things like that, versus more educative roles like informing people how the judicial system works. And I'm wondering if you're thinking about conduct as they should be limiting interactions to more professional avenues, or if you think there is a very regulated opportunity for these more personal interactions, and the line gets drawn at conspiracy theories and things like that. So I want to hear you talk about that for a moment. And then Sophia, going back to these other possible ways of thinking about, attractiveness or visual representation, I was thinking about other mechanisms of credibility around perhaps like, are they, do they hold a PhD in climate science, or are they a journalist who's done research versus a lay person, and thinking about whether I would be curious to know if a female presenting person who appears to be an expert, are they both being presented as similarly expert, and gender is the only difference, or are there other differentiating factors?
Yeah. Thank you for your two really exciting questions. So I had gotten a similar question about this discrepancy between elected judges and federal judges when I had first presented in this seminar. And the way that I kind of tackled that was by mainly focusing on elected judges. I think in terms of like the federal scope of the project, I would have loved to like include a chapter on like Ginny Thomas and Clarence Thomas and their relationship, which I'd spoken to my advisor at length about. But I think especially in terms of news stories, where you're able to really pick out these instances of where judges are behaving online in a more questionable manner. I feel like it's really fascinating when you take into account election law and financial campaigning regulations and things like that, because one of the judges that I had mentioned earlier, in his kind of pitch to get elected, he was leveraging those conspiracy theories and trying to like kind of make those emotional ties even further to voters, which was really fascinating in terms of learning about how conspiracy theories, especially like in a lot of like Cass Sunstein's work, understanding how they kind of create these roles of leveraging emotion, roles of leveraging reputation, and there was a third role, I think, of like information, in terms of learning how these connections are formed within judges. I think in terms of how I can probably in the future think about this problem. It's looking more specifically at the ways that these judges are using their own election strategies on Facebook. There wasn't too much when I ended up actually trying to like look into it, but I think it's still equally like fascinating to think about. And then for your second question, can you remind me of your second question? It was
we're short on time, so you and I can chat about
yeah.
it later.
Yeah, awesome.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll take one more. We're going to answer and then we'll take one more question.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So for my study, when I was creating the stimuli for the treatment, I tried really hard to keep it so that the only variables would be gender and pitch. So if you're curious, in both recording at the very beginning, the voice actors said that they're researchers at the University of Pennsylvania. But for that, I didn't intend to assert authority. That was my measure for like making this gender more salient, because they would say that my name is Emily and I'm a researcher. But it's definitely interesting if they say that they're, from different places and of different authority.
I'll say this quickly, and I am going to ask too big of a question to be answered. I just want to say, third student of the day, Maya, hello. But, okay, really great projects. I love how they interact. My question for both of you is there a tension between truth and democracy, or objectivity and democracy? For example, Maya, what if I and a majority of Americans want a judge to be partisan on a particular issue? What if there's 80% consensus about some kind of opinion, right? Is the maintenance of objectivity on that potentially anti-democratic, or could it, at a certain point, could you see that happening? I want some judges to be partisan on climate change, for example. And then Sophia, similarly, do we have the right to get it wrong in democracy, especially when the stakes are so big like climate change? Is there a difference between being persuaded and participating democratically? Can we solve climate change democratically? Asking that because I'm writing my dissertation about it. Thank you.
To try to keep my answer as short as possible, we could have like an hour-long conversation about this topic. But I think when you look back to Clarence Thomas is just top of mind because I'd recently read a New Yorker article about him, especially when he was being considered for his current position. I think it was very top of mind in thinking about wanting to have a judge or a judicial nominee be partisan, and so the public is aware of their different stances. I think for him it was specifically like women's reproductive rights. So I definitely feel like that society already exists in terms of there is a kind of flavor for wanting to have judges be more partisan or at least more clear. I remember like thinking back to my own experience working like with immigration and immigration courts. There was already, at least within the profession, an understanding of like which judges sided where and trying to get scheduling for your cases based on whichever judge you wanted to rule in a certain way. So I feel like we already kind of live in that society. And there's just so much more to like talk on, especially given COVID and given, especially gun rights in California, the discussion on like wanting to have having judges be more direct in communicating with their constituents.
Yeah. I'll also keep it super short, even though it's a really hard question to tackle. Personally, I think it'd be hard to solve climate change democratically, but also I think it's important not for gender and other peripheral factor to get in the way of information and how truth should be perceived. We should all perceive that without having some kind of a filter. That's my standpoint, I think.
All right, well, thank you very much for this.
Thank you.